Welcome to Advantage. I'm your host, David Young, and I hope you're having a good week. Some of you are on spring break, at least here in Kentucky. This week has been spring break for a lot of districts. And if you aren't on spring break this week, chances are you're on spring break next week. So, hallelujah for that. We even have a few districts in Kentucky that are on more of a closer to a year round calendar. So, for some of them, they have maybe a 2 week spring break or even a 3 week spring break. So if you're one of those, you've probably been on spring break already for a week or so. So anyway, I just want to congratulate you for being 3/4 of the way through the school year. It's been a tough winter around here, and I think in a lot of the eastern side of the country, it's been a rough winter with sickness and snow and other kinds of severe weather. And they're still, for some of those districts, they're still going to be going up into the month of June. And so spring break, really comes at a good time where we can rest and hopefully rejuvenate and be ready to sprint to the finish. And so anyway, congratulations for making it this far, and good luck as you work to finish the year in a really strong way. So today, I'd like to talk about a topic that I think most of us struggle with, not just in our schools or districts, but just something we struggle with uh, personally. And the thing I want to talk about is the concept of balance. Now, I've talked about balance before. I had a podcast episode, maybe a couple years ago with an executive coach named Chad Brown, and we talked about a specific type of balance. But when we say the word balance, a lot of times what we think about are things like work-life balance, and Chad and I talked about that on that episode. I recommend you go back and listen to it. It's one of the ones that I really enjoyed the most. But when it comes to just the concept of balance, nearly every person that I know, every organization, every political entity, every business struggles sometimes with balance. And if you don't believe me, think about personal things like your work-life balance. Typically, we struggle with that. Think about things like your weight, which comes, things that come into that are things like exercising regularly. We struggle to do that on a regular basis. We start and stop. Eating well. I know I personally struggle with eating well. I do a good job of it for a while, and then I lose my balance, and then I don't do a very good job of it instead of eating in a balanced, healthy way. And then those things impact things like your weight. And so we lose weight and then we gain it all back and then we lose it again. Maybe even your bank account. You may struggle with balance there to where you do a good job saving, and then for a while you spend too much and then you have to save again rather than operating in a balanced way. In business, you could think about things like the stock market. The stock market is based on people's investments, and it rarely holds steady. It goes way up, and then it goes down, and then maybe it kind of moderates and goes down again, and maybe it goes up again. So you can kind of see some of the business oriented struggles with balance through that. Now, I mentioned politics, political entities. So when you think about politics and balance, think about how we elect presidents. Now, I know, that one can get kind of explosive. A lot of people tend to operate in extremes when it comes to their political views these days. So I don't want to get into all that. What I'm saying is this: if you look throughout history, if a president serves 2 terms, particularly if they serve 2 terms, the next person we elect is almost always the polar opposite of the person who just served 2 terms. And sometimes that happens even if somebody just serves 1 term, if they have a really strong personality or a really strong style, a lot of times the next person who is elected is very much the opposite in terms of their ideals and even just their personalities and the way they go about their lives than the person that we had before in that office. So to start to draw connections to schools, it's not just presidents. In schools, we have principals that are in leadership positions. In districts, we have superintendents that are in leadership positions. And if you'll look over time, maybe in your own district or districts you know a lot about, the same type of thing happens. If a superintendent has been the superintendent for a number of years, many times the next superintendent will be very different than that person was. So in our schools and our organizations, we tend to not operate in a balanced way where we want a certain type of person that has balanced characteristics. We will hire somebody who's more on one extreme, and then the next person we hire will be on the other extreme. So that's what I'd like to talk about today. I want to examine some balance points in schools and districts that I think are just really important to be aware of. We struggle with balance, so awareness is really the first step. I spend a lot of time in schools, and my team that I work with here spends a lot of times in schools with me. So if something is on this list that I'm about to give you, that means that we see it a lot. So my goal today isn't necessarily to solve all of these balance problems, but it's to build an awareness. And with that said, if you've been listening for Advantage, I'm going to suggest some solutions, but I won't attempt to solve them all. I just want to make you aware that these balance points exist and maybe make some suggestions. And then hopefully that'll be something as you build an awareness that you'll be able to maybe adopt a little bit more balanced approach in regard to. So with that, let's jump in. Here are 7 balance points that are important for educational leaders. The first balance point is the balance between a comfortable learning environment, creating a comfortable learning environment inside your school or district, versus an environment that exudes high expectations, a sense of urgency among students and staff, sort of an environment where people are sitting kind of leaning forward or sitting on the edge of their seat, versus an environment where everybody is very comfortable and feels good, spending their time at the school or in the district. So when we go into schools, and we go into a lot of them, we never, it's rare that I use the word never. We never see a school district that is too heavy on the high expectations, sense of urgency, accountability, and I'm talking about for staff and students. We never see one that's too heavy on that side. But we always see that if it's out of balance, it's out of balance on the other side. It's comfortable, but it's too comfortable. There aren't enough high expectations. There aren't enough. There's not enough of a sense of urgency, etc. So if you feel like your school or district, or if you're at the district level, one of your schools struggles with balance in this area where it's very comfortable, but it's too comfortable, here are a few ways that you can encourage the principal and other leaders to start to address that to get a more healthy balance. First of all, they need agreed upon anchors. We talk about agreements a lot for how we'll do business. So they need those agreements. They need agreed upon anchors for curriculum and instruction that guide unit design and lesson design. It's important that that stuff is in place because it builds the foundation for the high expectations and the sense of urgency. The building leaders and even district leaders need to do frequent teacher growth walkthrough observations that are focused on those agreed upon anchors or those agreements. And this is important. I've talked on here before about the difference between teacher growth walkthroughs and like snapshot walkthroughs or trend data walkthroughs. If you want to build the sense of urgency and the high expectations and the accountability level inside your school, you need to be doing teacher growth walkthroughs that are based on those agreements. Third, the school leaders can do frequent professional learning community meetings, and once again, focused on the agreed upon anchors and the data that comes from classrooms and teachers implementing those. And then fourth, the principal can help the staff build an awareness about the difference between simple relationships and learning relationships. And that's something I've talked about on the podcast before as well. But essentially, many times when we are leading others and we know relationships are important, we tend to build what I would call simple relationships with them, which means that they know we care about them and they can trust us. And those two things are really important. But to get to a learning relationship where somebody's really deciding to follow you as the leader. So let's think about who all would that be. As the principal, you're hoping that your staff sees you as a leader and wants to follow you, and those two things are really important. That they need to know that you care about them, and they need to trust you. But there's a third thing. Teachers are leading students. And so the students need to feel that way about the teachers, know that they care about them and that they know about them and that they trust them. And then we're going to add this third thing. The same thing would be true of superintendents with the district staff or superintendents with the principals. The same thing would be true of coaches and their players. So those first two qualities are really important. But the last characteristic is that they have to believe that you as the leader can help them grow and help them learn and help them get to whatever goal it is that they have set for themselves. So they have to know that you know them, that you care about them, that they can trust you, but also that you can help them get to wherever it is that they want to go. So helping your staff recognize that their students are looking at them that way can help raise the level of expectation. It can help raise the sense of urgency and just the level of accountability in the school. So there's number one, balance between a comfortable learning environment and an environment where there are high expectations. The second balance point that we see a lot in schools and districts is that it's important that you have a nonpartisan approach to decision making. So I'll say that one again. It's important that you're making your decisions in a nonpartisan way. So partisan means party lines with, Republican, Democrat, other types of political affiliations. And here's why that's important. Unfortunately, in society today, everything seems to have a political slant. So what I would say to you to get balance in this area is don't get yourself in trouble by, quote, dying on a hill of a word that you want to make sure that you're able to use or a stance that you'd like to take that has a political slant to it. When we do that, I think sometimes we do that because we want to quote, to win or to quote, be right in our stances. But here's what we have to remember. Winning in education means that we get to do what we need to do to help students see success. So my advice to you on this balance point is try not to get too hung up in the politics. Don't get caught up in the latest political struggle. Instead, just focus on kids, not politics. Focus on students as the people that they are and try to do what's best for them in each and every situation, even though that's going to be a little different in each and every situation. If you approach those situations with solely a what's best for this child in this situation, not that you never get in a sticky situation, but it keeps you from maybe getting in all of the political muck that goes along, unfortunately, with everything in society, and that bleeds into our schools as well. The third balance point is finding a balance between what's best for an individual student versus what's best for all students. And that one is as old as school itself. And I'm going to be honest with you, this is a tough one. It is a balance point that we see a lot. Like I said, it's been around for a long time. And the truth is, it's kind of a judgment call that varies by situation. Now, I will say, whenever this balance point becomes a topic of conversation, it is almost always because the rights of an individual student are infringing on the rights of all students or of a bigger, um, and maybe I shouldn't say infringing on the rights. It's what's happening with one student is significantly affecting other students. So I'll say this, um, when we mess it up, we typically do it because we're putting the rights of an individual student, or we're catering to that student to the point that it is significantly negatively impacting a larger group of students. So I would look there first. Like I said, there's not a hard and fast solution for this one, other than you have to take each individual situation based on its own merits. Certainly, it's important to take care of individual students and their needs. But when you get into that balance point between that and what's right for all students, you have to take that on a case by case basis. The fourth balance point has to do, this is more of an elementary thing. So I'm going to talk about it just quickly. In elementary schools, we see a struggle with the science of reading. Now, science of reading is not new, but it is the thing. There was a podcast put out a while back called Sold a Story, and it was about how the science of reading is really the best way to teach students how to read in grades K1, 2, even into third grade. And it has science of reading has a heavy emphasis on phonics, and phonics are important. That phonics instruction, extremely important. Phonemic awareness, really important. But a balance point that we see sometimes we're in schools is teachers are learning about science of reading. And so they are literally doing, they have a 90-minute reading block and they're doing phonics for 85 minutes. So there is balance there inside science of reading. There are other components. There are comprehension skills. There is fluency, vocabulary, phonics, and phonemic awareness. So there's 5 different components there. And it's important that you don't get unbalanced so that 95% of what students are doing learning to read is phonics and phonemic awareness. It's important to be working on those other skills as well. And then the fifth one is also an elementary one, and it has to do with science of reading as well. And it's the balance point between science of reading versus explicitly teaching reading standards, your likely your state standards for reading. And again, what we see many times is in those elementary classrooms, they have a 90-minute reading block, and let's say they don't have an imbalance of phonics. Let's say they're just doing the 5 components of reading, but they're doing that for the whole 90 minutes. They're not ever explicitly teaching a state standard. And what I believe is going on there is teachers believe, many teachers in K through 2 or even third grade believe that if they just teach the science of reading and they do it for 90 minutes every day, that it'll take care of all the standards. And I wish that it was a perfect overlap like that, but unfortunately it's not. It's more like a Venn diagram. So there's a sliver in the middle where if they do science of reading for 90 minutes, they're going to cover some of the standards, but they're not going to explicitly teach them all. And the flip side would be true as well. If all they were doing is explicitly teaching standards through learning targets and those kinds of things, if they did that for the whole 90 minutes, there would be some elements of science of reading that wouldn't be covered as well. So it's important that within that block that they have a balance where part of the time they're doing science of reading and part of the time they're explicitly teaching reading standards. We're almost to the end. Our 6th balance point is teaching content, and I'm in the classroom still now with teachers, teaching content versus teaching skills. So let's talk a little bit about that. I'll say that again, teaching content versus teaching skills. And when I say skills, I don't mean skills like multiplication or reading comprehension. Those are skills that are real closely related to the content. I'm talking about skills like collaboration, perseverance, being an informed citizen, many of those things that show up on like a profile of a graduate or a profile of a learner. So teaching content, which comes in your standards, versus teaching skills. So here would be my suggestion on how to make sure you find that balance. Remember that the content is what students need to know. Um, it's the stuff. It's the vocabulary. It's the skills directly related to the vocabulary. It might be some context where kids need to be able to solve mathematical problems in real world situations. So in real world situations is the context, but it's the what. It's the things that kids need to know. Those skills are more about the learning experience, and it's the learning experience is what typically develops the students. So think about I guess I would say it this way: the content is the what, and the skills are the how teachers are teaching. What types of learning experiences are kids having? So, for instance, if you want kids to be able to collaborate, um, that's not what you're teaching them, that's how you're teaching them. You're getting them into groups so that they get the experience of collaborating, and you're giving them feedback on how well they're collaborating. If you want to develop the skill of perseverance, then that's you aren't teaching kids perseverance like in a lesson. You're putting them in situations where they have to develop that skill of perseverance. And that's different than the content that you're teaching each day. So think about these examples, content versus skills. For content, you have mathematical standards, but for skills, you have the 8 mathematical practices. So if you're a teacher or an instructional leader, I hope our principals that are listening are instructional leaders. You may be familiar with the 8 mathematical practices. Those are more about how you're teaching math and the skills you're developing in students by how you're teaching more than what you're teaching, which is the mathematics standards. Over on the English or reading side, there would be English standards. That's the content, what you're teaching, versus like interdisciplinary literacy practices, kind of like the mathematical practices. These are practices that you can transfer, they're skills that you can transfer from English over into other subject areas and other situations. And then the third one I would ask you to think about is, think about like high stakes accountability, standardized testing. That's more content based, and maybe some skills directly related to the content. But the other side of that coin is like 21st century skill development, soft skills, work ready skills, or whatever you want to call them. And those might be developed by other things that are more about the learning experience and what types of situations students are being put in by the teacher in order to develop those skills. And then the seventh balance point has to do with finances. Budgeting, the way you budget, the balance between budgeting for fixed costs, like how much your copier costs, if you have to pay insurance on your building, if you have to, your salaries are fixed cost. If you have a certain material that you have to buy every single year, those are fixed cost. So budgeting for those kinds of costs versus budgeting for priority areas, which are areas that you have goals in as a school or as a district that you want to achieve. So to tackle that balance point, what I would say is pay attention to your budget. And if everything in your budget almost is a fixed cost, including things like giving teachers or departments a certain amount of money each year, if that has become a fixed cost for you, it becomes hard then for you to fund priorities that are maybe the priorities this year are different than the priorities were last year. Maybe the priorities next year will be different than they are this year. So these are more short-term priorities and goals. And in your budget, you have to balance it out so that you're covering fixed cost, but you're leaving enough funding to pursue whatever the priorities are that you have. So you have to look at, if I, where am I dedicating fixed cost money, and are there places there where I can draw that down or where I can save some funding in order to put it in these priority areas. If you don't do that, it's hard for your school to improve because sometimes improvement costs money and you have to be able to budget for that. So as I wrap up today, here's the last thing I'll say. Um, Today we've been looking at balance like it's a scale. Like if you think about not like a scale that you step on to weigh yourself, but one of those scales that tips back and forth. And we've been thinking about it in terms of having a balanced approach where it's this versus this, and both of those need to have relatively equal weight. And I do think it's important to think of balance that way. And the things we've talked about today, I think that's a really good way to envision those. But a couple years ago, I mentioned that I had an executive coach on the podcast named Chad Brown. And we were talking about a specific balance point, and he had a great way of looking at it. And I never thought about this before. He said, David, sometimes we think about balance like a scale. But he said, another way to think about balance is like balancing a broom stick on your hand, on the palm of your hand. He said, have you ever done that? I was like, yeah, I was a kid. He said, so you put the end of the broomstick in your hand, and the brush part is up at the top, and you're looking up at it and you're trying to balance it to keep it from falling over. And he said that's a different kind of balance. And he said the thing you need to remember about that kind of balance, he said, in order to keep that broom balanced on your hand, you have to focus on the brushy side up at the top. He said you have to look at the top. You don't really ever look at your hand. If you keep your focus on the top of the broom, then you are much more likely to be able to balance it. You just kind of naturally move in such a way that you'll balance it. And he said, I think sometimes when we're looking for balance, we need to keep our focus on the end result. And if we keep our eyes focused on what we want the end result to be, it allows you to kind of move and keep the right balance that you need. Because he said sometimes you need one side to be heavier than the other, but not forever. You just need it to be heavier than the other for a little while so you can keep the broom balanced. And then you have to make another move. But if you'll keep your eyes focused on the end, many times you'll make the moves that you need to make in order to keep the balance that you need to have. So I just wanted to share that with you today because I think that's different than the type of balance we've been talking about today, but it kind of applies as well. So wanted to make sure you thought of it that way in addition to the way that we've been discussing it today. So with that, that is all for today. Thank you again for joining me, and I hope you have a great week. I hope you have a productive week, and I hope you're able to find some of these balance points in your school or district as you go throughout this week and the next. And so until then, I will see you next time. Take care.